Listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you was never meant for your ears. There are records in dusty county ledgers that should have been destroyed, names scratched into census books that were never supposed to be spoken aloud again, and graves that even now lie hidden beneath a blanket of earth with no stone to mark them. They tell of a family that sealed itself away from the world, deep in the Appalachian Mountains where the ridges are so steep the sun itself seems hesitant to break through. A family whose bloodline curled inward like a serpent devouring its own tail, generation after generation, until the very distinction between parent and child blurred, until identity itself dissolved into something unrecognizable. Imagine this: a lone cabin built on a slope where no one sane would settle. No farmland, no orchards, no path carved for trade or passage. The windows did not look out toward the valley, but inward, facing only the hill itself, as if to turn its gaze away from the world. Neighbors rarely saw them. Preachers, surveyors, taxmen, they tried to knock on that door, but most came away unsettled, their reports written in terse notes, their handwriting shaking on the page. 6 occupants, but no children visible. Children were there, of course, but hidden, kept behind the heavy door, voices never heard. Their lives recorded only in whispers, in brief flashes on census forms, and then erased again like chalk washed off a slate. The locals knew better than to wander too close. Parents warned their children not to play past the ridge, not to follow the smoke rising from the trees where no sound of life came with it. Hunters came back shaken, swearing that they had seen movement in the shadows of the cabin, but no barking dog, no laughter, no cry of an infant, just the dull certainty that someone, something, watched them from the other side of glass. For decades, this family was tolerated the way you tolerate a shadow in the corner of your vision, or a cold draft in a room where no window is open. They traded with no one. They attended no churches, no funerals. They didn't marry outsiders, didn't sign their names in the social fabric of the mountain communities. Their absence from the world was not accidental. It was chosen. And what does a family become when all it has is itself? What happens to bloodlines when they circle inward decade after decade, until the very foundation of survival, the mixing of families, the joining of different names, has been replaced by a law of enclosure? A law written down in a journal, its words reversed like a mirror to keep prying eyes from understanding. The blood must be kept pure. That was their creed. That was their prison. The truth of their collapse lies in fragments scattered across time. An infant's brief mention in a church registry, only to vanish from the next year's records. A burial ground of tiny, uneven mounds hidden in the trees behind the cabin, where children without names were returned to the soil before they had the chance to live. In one priest's weary note scrawled in the margins of a baptismal book, "Brought forth dead, no baptism." In the shaky lines of a student doctor's field notes describing deformities of the jaw, twisted bones, vacant stares, and a family tree that refused to branch outward. But what's most chilling is not the isolation, not even the death. It is the silence. The way institutions, universities, doctors, local officials chose not to study them, not to preserve the evidence, not to acknowledge what they had seen. Reports stamped withdrawn, journals locked away in archives never released to the public. Files burned, stories buried, graves left unmarked. A whole family line erased not by accident, but by design. Ask yourself, why? Why would officials deliberately strike their names from the record? Why would doctors retreat from their findings? Why would county files vanish into nothing? Was it shame? An embarrassment at what had been allowed to exist, generation after generation, under the nose of civilized society? Or was it something darker? A recognition that this family was not simply an accident of isolation, but a living reminder of what happens when secrecy and control are enforced over blood, over names, over identity itself. Tonight, we will open that sealed box. We will walk into the hollow where no road was drawn, stand in the shadow of the cabin that was said to reject intrusion, and we will stare directly into the abyss of what happens when a family becomes a fortress against the world. This is not folklore. These are not ghost stories. This is documented, written in ledgers, hidden in archives, whispered by survivors, and buried by institutions that did not want you to know. Because what lies here is not just the story of a single Appalachian family. It is a mirror, a warning, a pattern. When secrecy becomes law, when purity becomes obsession, when the outside world is declared forbidden, you do not preserve life. You collapse it. And the collapse leaves scars, not just on the body, not just in the graves, but in the silence that follows. If you are here now, it is because you are ready to hear what others have buried. You are ready to look where others have looked away. But understand this, once you open your ears to these truths, once you allow them into your mind, you cannot unhear them. The descent begins now, and by the end, you will not look at family, at blood, at history itself the same way again. The descent always begins quietly. On paper it looks harmless, columns of ink in government records, names copied down by hand every 10 years as census takers walk the ridges and valleys of Appalachia. But the deeper you follow these columns, the more you begin to feel something wrong beneath the surface. The census books of the late 19th and early 20th century tell a story so subtle, most historians never bother to read between the lines. Pages filled with the expected disorder of mountain life, families with 10 or 12 children, lodgers taken in for the winter, neighbors intermarrying until surnames knit entire counties together. But then, amid the chaotic sprawl of human survival, one household repeats itself like a broken incantation. The same surname, the same cluster of first names, decade after decade. In 1870, there they are, a man, his wife, a few children. In 1880, the same names appear again. By 1900, John, Mary, Elias, Sarah, reborn on paper, children of the same ages as those listed 20 years before. At first glance, a careless reader assumes these must be grandchildren, or that the census taker was sloppy, recycling names without care. But when you track the details, birth years, household ages, kinship structures, the pattern becomes unmistakable. These were not branches growing outward. They were repetitions folding inward. Historians who studied these pages in the mid-20th century admitted their confusion. One wrote bluntly, "The family tree cannot be reconstructed, kinship structure uncertain." Names were recycled endlessly, identities blurred. Parents and children seemed interchangeable, siblings and cousins indistinguishable. Even trained genealogists abandoned the effort, declaring the lineage a collapse rather than a tree. That collapse is what makes the record so disturbing. Where other families expanded, intermarried, and moved outward into the wider world, this one dug inward, circling itself until no outsider entered, no new blood mingled, no new name appeared. But repetition alone is not what unnerved investigators. It was the silence between the lines. In many households, occupations are listed: farmer, laborer, preacher, teacher. But for this family, the occupation columns are often left blank, decade after decade. Sometimes the word farm labor is scrawled, but no details follow. Where neighboring families are surrounded by notes of trade, property, and livestock, this household exists like a shadow, present but unaccounted for. In 1910, a census worker left a faint note in the margin: "Children present, no father identified." In 1930, another scribbled only 2 words: "as before." These notes are not loud, not explicit, but they carry a weight. The weight of someone who has seen enough to know that what they are recording cannot be explained in the neat boxes of government paperwork. Now, pause for a moment and ask yourself, why were these entries allowed to stand for so long without intervention? Why, when the pattern became unmistakable, did no authority step in, no church demand answers, no doctor call for investigation? The truth is unsettling, because silence itself is a kind of protection. In the Appalachian Mountains of the late 1800s, poverty was common, isolation expected. Families lived and died in valleys so remote that the law was more rumor than presence. And yet, this family's silence was deeper than mere poverty. It was not just solace, and by chance, it was isolation by design. When preachers tried to reach them, they were met with the door closed. When census takers asked questions, the answers were clipped and final, and slowly the outside world accepted it. The family became less a lineage and more a boundary, a fixed landmark of silence. People spoke of them the way they spoke of a ridge or a cave, immovable, unchanging, existing outside the flow of ordinary life. But the deeper you read, the more you see that their silence infected the very documents meant to preserve them. Entire decades where infants appear in records only to vanish in the next, their existence cut short before they could be named. Entire generations where the same handful of names repeat until it becomes impossible to tell one life from another. What you are seeing in these pages is not a genealogy, but a loop that tightens like a noose. And here is the part that institutions never wanted public. When researchers stumbled upon this family in the mid-20th century, when genealogists, anthropologists, and medical students began to notice the peculiar patterns, the response was not curiosity but retreat. Files stamped withdrawn, pedigree charts half completed, then abandoned, notes on deformities, slurred speech, or inconsistent ages quietly shelved and left to rot in university basements. Ask yourself, why withdraw? Why leave the story unfinished? It is one thing to study malnutrition, poverty, or disease. It is another to confront the living consequences of deliberate enclosure, of bloodlines folding inward on themselves until human distinction itself erodes. To record it is to reveal something institutions fear, that human systems can collapse not just in wars or famines, but in the secrecy of a single household repeating itself in silence. The choice to withdraw was a choice to suppress, to let the family disappear back into obscurity rather than risk confronting the implications. It was easier to let their existence remain a whisper in census books than to admit publicly what they had found. And that suppression matters, because when institutions bury knowledge, when they erase evidence, when they strike files and withdraw reports, they are not just hiding the truth of one family, they are revealing their own fear. Fear of what happens when purity becomes law, fear of what happens when secrecy becomes survival, fear of the abyss that opens when identity itself is swallowed whole by repetition. The story of this family, preserved in ink and then buried in silence, is not just about genetics. It is about control, about what happens when outsiders are rejected so completely that blood itself becomes a prison, about what happens when communities look away and when institutions, faced with uncomfortable truths, choose suppression instead of illumination. Remember this: the census is supposed to preserve identity, to record the living story of a people. But here, in this hollow of the Appalachians, it preserved something else entirely. Not identity, but collapse. Not lineage, but the slow suffocation of a family line folding in on itself. And it leaves us with a question: who benefits from silence? When the truth of this family was buried in archives and their graves left unmarked, who was protected? Them or the rest of us? Every mystery has a moment where speculation ends and proof steps forward. For this family, that moment came not through rumor, nor census, nor whispers in the valley. It came through fire. The cabin that had stood for nearly a century, darkened logs stacked against the mountain slope, burned to ash one winter's night. Neighbors, who rarely approached the place, climbed the ridge at dawn and found nothing but a blackened skeleton of wood. The forest around it was untouched. The fire had not spread. It had consumed only the house, as though it was meant for no other target. Among the ruins, officials catalogued what they expected to find: iron cookware warped from heat, fragments of furniture, the broken handles of tools. But in the ashes, something survived: a book, a leather-bound journal, its cover charred and cracked, yet its pages miraculously intact. The entry in county records is clinical: book preserved despite total destruction of dwelling. But the contents were anything but ordinary. When investigators opened the volume, they found page after page filled not with blank space but with writing, except the words were backwards, mirror writing, as though deliberately designed to evade casual readers. You could not simply read the entries with your eyes. You had to hold the page to glass or place a mirror at its side to restore its meaning. and when the words came clear, they carried a single chilling refrain. The blood must be kept pure. That phrase repeats itself across decades of entries, sometimes written in the calm tone of instruction, other times in the severe voice of commandment. Variations appear. Line unbroken. No new name shall enter. Names must return. Again and again the journal insists on one truth. Enclosure is not accident. It is law. This was no diary of weather or harvest, no record of daily life in a rural hollow. It was doctrine. A text written less as memory and more as preservation, as though meant to be passed to the next generation like scripture. The handwriting, consistent across years, belonged to what investigators presumed was an elder, a patriarch or matriarch of the family, someone entrusted to maintain the law of repetition. And make no mistake, it was law. The family was not simply cut off by geography, they enforced their own isolation with ritual precision. By recycling names, by refusing marriages to outsiders, by burying infants without stones or records, they were following a commandment written in fireproof ink. Even when the cabin collapsed into ash, the words endured. Even when the forest grew around them, the mantra survived. The blood must be kept pure. Ask yourself, why backwards? Why write every entry in mirrored script when it takes extra effort, when it turns the simple act of reading into a puzzle? Some researchers argue it was to keep outsiders ignorant. If a census taker or preacher stumbled upon the journal, they would see gibberish, not doctrine. But there is another possibility. Mirror writing forces the writer themselves to engage differently. Each word is a ritual, an act of concealment. The very structure of the text becomes a shield, and shields are only needed when the truth is dangerous. What was this family guarding? Was it pride, fear, obedience to a half-remembered tradition? Or was it something darker, an understanding that their choice to remain sealed was leading them down a path they dared not put into plain sight? The journal does not speak of God, though it uses the cadence of scripture. It does not speak of neighbors, trade, or community. It speaks only of kin, of names, of purity, over and over, as if repeating it could make it true, as if repetition could hold back the decay pressing in at the edges of their lineage. And yet, the graves tell another story. The graves of infants buried behind the house in unmarked earth, the mortality rate far above even the brutal averages of mountain life, the physical malformations recorded by doctors decades later. These were not the signs of purity preserved. They were the signs of collapse. The mantra in the journal had not saved them. It had doomed them. But here is where the unease deepens. The county did not publish the journal. The fragments we know of today come from later researchers citing documents they were not supposed to have. The full text is absent from archives. A single brief note in official records confirms its existence, but no transcript appears in public files. The journal was taken, sealed, and hidden away. Again, the silence. Institutions burying evidence, not because it lacked importance, but because it carried too much. Because the words inside it, the blood must be kept pure, were not simply the creed of a single family. They echoed a broader obsession, one that haunted entire societies across history. From royal houses guarding their bloodlines, to regimes obsessed with racial purity, to cults enforcing inward collapse under the guise of spiritual protection. The mantra is always the same. Enclosure, control, purity at all costs. And when purity becomes law, death always follows. The graves behind the cabin are proof. The malformed skeletons examined decades later are proof. The silent erasures in census records are proof. The family had written their own doom into doctrine, and the doctrine survived the fire. Now pause here, because I want you to consider something important, a truth you were never meant to see. The mantra of this family is not unique. It is part of a pattern, one that repeats across centuries, across civilizations, across institutions that still shape your life today. The blood must be kept pure. How different is that really from the systems that tell you who is worthy, who is unclean, who belongs inside, and who must be shut out? How different is it from the laws, the ideologies, the unspoken rules that decide whose name survives in records and whose is erased forever? The journal is a relic of one family, but it is also a mirror, and what it shows us is not just a cabin in Appalachia, It is a warning of what happens when the obsession with purity consumes a lineage, a community, a nation. The fire should have destroyed it, but the words survived. Because ideas like this rarely burn, they linger, they wait, and they return in new forms, new disguises, new institutions that speak with cleaner voices, but carry the same hunger beneath. The family in the hollow is gone, but the law they followed, the law of enclosure, the law of purity, still breathes, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. If the journal was doctrine, then the graves were its scripture written in earth. Hidden behind the cabin, beneath a canopy of oak and sycamore, the ground tells a truth that no fire could erase. For years, the graves were nothing more than uneven mounds of dirt. No stones, no markers, no carved names to preserve the memory of the dead. To stumble across them was to stumble into silence, the kind of silence that pulls the air from your lungs. Researchers who mapped the site decades later found what neighbors had whispered but never proven. The burial ground was small, too small for the number of bodies it contained. Uneven depressions in the soil revealed at least a dozen graves. Careful excavation revealed more, tiny skeletons, their bones fragile as twigs, many of them belonging to infants and children no older than 5. And here lies the most unsettling truth. In mountain communities of the 19th and early 20th centuries, child mortality was tragically common. But this was something else. These children had not died of cholera or fever, or the epidemics that ravaged the valleys. Many had deformities, spines twisted like roots, jaws misaligned, skulls showing signs of hydrocephaly, limbs unnaturally short or curved. Their deaths were not random. They were symptoms of bloodlines folding inward, collapses, under the weight of repetition. The journal's refrain, "The blood must be kept pure," had demanded a sacrifice, and the graves were payment. There is a kind of cruelty in erasure. These children were buried without stones, without inscriptions, without the dignity of names. In the hollow, only the soil remembered them. No birth records survived, no baptismal notes, no census entries beyond a line or two of vanished ink. It was as if the family itself had chosen to erase them, to hide the evidence of what purity had cost, to preserve the law by burying its victims in silence. One researcher in the 1950s described the site in language that still chills. The ground moved like a field of unmarked books, each grave a page written in silence, each mound a word that could not be spoken. He left no photographs, only sketches. But even his sketches were later withdrawn from publication, as if the graves themselves carried too heavy a weight to share. And yet, fragments survived. Bones were taken for study, measured, catalogued in quiet reports that never reached public archives. Doctors noted cranial abnormalities consistent with incestuous reproduction, congenital malformations of the limbs, and signs of malnutrition. They concluded, in language as cold as stone, lineage collapse through repeated consanguinity. The words are clinical, but the reality is not. These were children, flesh, blood, voices that never had the chance to echo beyond the cabin walls. It is tempting to see the burial ground as an ending, a sad coda to a family's isolation. But the truth is darker. The graves do not mark an end. They mark continuity, because the family kept repeating the cycle. For every mound of earth, another child was born. For every malformed skeleton, another name was recycled in the journal. The law of purity remained unbroken, even as it consumed its own future. Pause here and imagine it. Imagine living in that cabin, raising a child born of such repetition, knowing the risk, knowing the likely outcome. Imagine writing the same commandment into a journal, year after year, while digging fresh earth behind the house for another small grave. What kind of belief, what kind of obsession can make a person choose silence over survival, secrecy over life itself? It is almost unbearable to think that no one intervened. But that is exactly what happened. The outside world, when it glimpsed the truth, looked away. Officials buried reports, doctors withdrew findings, universities sealed documents. The graves, like the journal, became part of a pattern of silence. And silence is not neutral. Silence is complicity. By the time researchers mapped the burial ground in the mid-20th century, the family's line was already fading. Surviving members, twisted by both biology and secrecy, lived in shadows, rarely venturing beyond the ridge. Locals described them as ghostly, like figures glimpsed at dusk, moving awkwardly through the trees, avoiding paths, avoiding light. The graves grew moss, leaves blanketed the mounds, and the soil folded them deeper into forgetting. But the ground remembers, always. And when we look at these graves, we see more than a family's tragedy. We see a warning, because the graves are not unique to one hollow, one mountain, one family. Across history, wherever obsession with purity has taken root, the ground fills with unmarked children. In castles where royal bloodlines collapsed into madness, in communities where outsiders were forbidden and insiders consumed themselves, in nations where the law of purity became national doctrine, the soil still bears the scars. The graves in Appalachia are smaller, humbler, unmarked, but they belong to the same pattern. They are evidence of what happens when secrecy becomes creed, when obsession replaces survival, when purity demands silence as its offering. And here is the most disturbing part. The graves behind the cabin are still there. Locals whisper about them, hikers stumble across them, researchers sketch them in hushed tones. They have never been marked, never been given names, never been consecrated. They remain as they always were, a hidden scripture of earth, whispering a truth too heavy to speak aloud. Think about that the next time you walk through woods, the next time you pass uneven ground where leaves settle strangely, where the soil feels thinner underfoot. How many secrets lie beneath? How many lives erased to preserve laws never meant to survive? The burial ground behind the cabin is not just a graveyard. It is a message, written in silence, carved into soil, preserved in bones. And its message is simple, devastating, inescapable. Purity is not survival. It is collapse. The graves gave bones, and bones gave evidence. For the first time, secrecy could not hide behind whispers or folklore. It could be measured, weighed, compared against medical records. And in the middle of the 20th century, when anthropology and medicine collided in the Appalachian Mountains, several doctors and researchers stumbled into the hollow and left with notes that should have changed history. But those notes never reached you. The first official examination of the remains took place quietly in the 1940s. A local doctor, trained in Louisville, had been summoned after rumors spread of crooked children living on the ridge. He flew, and the cabin already abandoned, the graves already sinking. But his curiosity drew him deeper. With a small team, he exhumed several bodies under the pretense of public health. What he found disturbed him enough to write in blunt clinical terms. Craniofacial malformations consistent with close consanguinity, dwarfism in multiple specimens, evidence of congenital hydrocephalus, line of descent evidently restricted within immediate kin. That report was never published. It was typed on county letterhead, filed into a drawer, and marked with a single word: closed. A decade later, in the 1950s, a second investigation was carried out, this time by anthropologists from a nearby university. Their mission was to study isolated cultural groups in Appalachia. But once they reached the hollow, they realized they were not dealing with culture. They were dealing with collapse. Field notes describe a lineage visibly deteriorated under genetic restriction, children displaying identical malformations across generations, and, chillingly, a burial ground that suggests 1 out of every 3 births resulted in early death. The anthropologists sketched the graves, catalogued bone fragments, and carried samples back to the university for further study. But those samples too vanished into archives. When later researchers inquired, they were told the material had been misplaced, an entire burial ground reduced to a filing error. Why? Why would science turn away from evidence so rare, so revealing, so vital? Because science is not neutral. It never has been. Research is shaped by money, by politics, by the fears of institutions that rely on public trust. To publish findings of an American family collapsing into deformity through incest would have forced uncomfortable questions about poverty, about neglect, about the nation's own myths of progress and purity. It was easier to bury the evidence than to confront it. There is one document, however, that survived. In the late 1960s, a medical student writing his thesis stumbled across fragments of the earlier investigations. He included a single haunting line in his otherwise routine study. The case demonstrates the terminal consequences of enforced isolation. Inbreeding is not simply a cultural footnote, It is biological suicide. His thesis was filed, graded, and locked away. When outside scholars later searched for it, they discovered the volume had been removed from the library shelf. The catalogue number still exists, but the book itself does not. Over and over the same pattern: discovery, documentation, disappearance. The silence was not accidental, it was deliberate. And it tells us something crucial. The story of this family is not just about their secrecy. It is about the secrecy of the institutions that surrounded them. Doctors who chose careers over truth, universities that chose reputation over disclosure, county officials who chose quiet over scandal. The family's silence was mirrored by society's silence, each protecting itself, each refusing to speak. And yet, just enough fragments escaped, enough to piece together a shadow of the truth, enough to reconstruct what those doctors saw when they laid bones across a table and measured skulls with calipers, enough to remind us that silence does not erase, it only delays. One surviving letter, written by a county health officer in 1953, captures the conflict with almost unbearable clarity. It reads, "What we have seen here is not merely a local matter. It is emblematic of a larger failure. If we speak of it openly, it will shame us. If we bury it, it will return." And it has returned. Not in the form of new graves, but in the whisper of archives, in the persistence of rumors, in the unease you feel even now as you hear this story. Silence never destroys the truth. It only feeds it, makes it heavier, more dangerous, more unbearable when it finally surfaces. Now pause and think about this. The doctors who studied these remains were not villains. They were men and women of science trained to pursue knowledge, and yet they chose silence. Why? Perhaps because the truth unsettled not just their subjects but themselves. Because in those bones they saw a mirror of something larger. They saw that purity, this obsession with enclosure, was not confined to a single hollow. It was written into institutions, into laws, into cultures that they themselves were part of. And so the doctors looked away. The universities closed files, the county stamped closed, and the family slipped back into shadow. But here is the haunting irony. The more these institutions tried to bury the truth, the more powerful it became. Because the fragments that survive are more disturbing than a complete record would have been. A full report could have been dissected, debated, contextualized. But fragments, half-erased sketches, notes pulled from fire, missing theses, these create something else. They create myth. They create dread. They create the sense of a truth too heavy to hold, too dangerous to write, too shameful to admit. And that dread is what has lasted. Not the names, not the dates, not the full medical charts. Only the silence, and the sense that behind it lies something we were never meant to see. The family is gone now, at least in the form it once took. The graves remain. The journal may still exist in some sealed archive. The bones may still gather dust in a box mislabeled in a university basement. But the institutions that buried the truth have not vanished. They still operate. They still decide what you are allowed to know and what is stamped closed. So ask yourself, how many other journals lie hidden in drawers? How many other graves have been mapped, sketched, then erased from the record? How many other families have been silenced, not by fire, not by soil, but by the decision of a university dean, a county clerk, a federal office that decided some truths were too dangerous to publish? The silence surrounding this family is not unique. It is systemic, it is deliberate, and it continues. The official record ends with silence. Closed files, misplaced bones, journals erased from shelves. If you follow only the sanctioned archives, the story stops in the 1960s, as if the family simply dissolved into soil. But the mountains remember, and the mountains speak, just not in the language of textbooks. They speak in whispers, in warnings, in rumors carried from porch to porch, generation to generation. And if you listen closely, you'll hear that the bloodline never truly vanished. Even today, in remote parts of Appalachia, locals talk about them carefully, lowering their voices when the subject arises. They don't say the family's name, sometimes because they've forgotten it, sometimes because they refuse to speak it aloud. Instead, they call them the hollow people, the ridge ones, or simply them, as if the name itself is a curse that summons shadows. Hunters still report strange encounters on that ridge. They talk about hearing footsteps behind them when no one should be there, about catching glimpses of pale faces through the trees, watching, then vanishing, about cabins that look deserted by day but glow faintly with firelight at night. These stories never make the papers, but they circulate like wildfire around campfires and in the back corners of gas stations. Always the same theme: the family never really died out. Some of the whispers are darker still. A woman in her 70s, interviewed in the late 1990s, told researchers that when she was a child, her parents warned her never to wander near the ridge because they still keep their own. She recalled seeing children who looked alike in uncanny ways: eyes too far apart, heads too broad, movements unsteady, as if each generation was a faint echo of the last. She said they would appear briefly, standing at the edge of the schoolyard, then vanish before anyone could speak to them. Were these truly descendants? Survivors who escaped the hollow but carried its bloodline in their bodies? Or were they projections, phantoms created by fear, by memory, by the mountain's hunger to preserve its secrets? Some researchers believe fragments of the bloodline still exist, scattered through Appalachia. They point to small, isolated communities where genetic disorders cluster inexplicably, where surnames repeat across every headstone in a churchyard, where family trees twist inward instead of branching outward. These communities are not alone. Throughout history, isolated groups have carried heavy genetic burdens. But here, the echoes of that one family blur into legend, making it impossible to separate science from story. Consider this. DNA studies in the last 2 decades have revealed hidden webs of kinship across Appalachia. Small pockets of people distantly related, tied together by ancestors who refuse to leave the mountains. Some of those strands may trace back to the hollow, but no researcher dares to publish such a claim. To connect modern families to the most infamous inbred lineage in Appalachia would be to curse them, to brand them with a stigma they did not choose. And so, once again, silence prevails. But silence does not stop the stories. A nurse in eastern Kentucky recalled treating a boy in the 1980s who was different. His facial features matched old medical sketches from the buried reports. When she asked his mother about family history, the woman grew pale, refused to answer, and walked out of the clinic, never to return. The boy's records ended there, his name erased from school rolls, his family vanished from census counts a year later. Coincidence? Or another survival of the bloodline, carefully hidden by relatives who knew too well what happened when outsiders asked questions? Others tell of an abandoned house deep in the woods filled with crude carvings on the walls, strange symbols, names repeated over and over, scratched backward like the old journal. Local teenagers dared each other to enter in the 1990s, but many refused, saying the house smelled wrong, as if decay lingered in the wood itself. The house was later burned in a fire of unknown origin. No investigation followed, just another structure erased, another chance at evidence lost. The persistence of these rumors raises a chilling possibility that the family's story is not finished, that while the official files were closed, life went on in hidden places. Children were still born, graves were still dug, and somewhere, perhaps even now, descendants of that family walk among us, carrying both the weight of their ancestry and the silence that has protected them for generations. But think about what that means. If they exist, they are not monsters. They are not myths. They are people, flesh and blood, struggling with a history they never asked for, a burden placed upon them by the choices of ancestors who locked the doors and refused the world. And yet, society has already decided their story is too disturbing, too shameful to acknowledge. So they live in rumor, in shadow, in whispers about them. And this brings us to the heart of the modern silence. The family may be gone, or they may survive in fragments, but the fear they inspire has become larger than truth itself. Fear has become the inheritance. Fear has become the bloodline. When a society buries truth, it does not vanish. It mutates. It turns into rumor, into haunting, into a shadow that lingers even in the 21st century. That is what this family has become, a haunting. Not just of Appalachia, but of history itself. A reminder that what we refuse to face will never stop staring back at us from the trees. So tonight, When you hear a story about strange faces in the woods, about names erased from census rolls, about children who vanish from school registers, ask yourself, are these just campfire tales? Or are they the last breaths of a bloodline too disturbing to be spoken of openly? The family's silence may have been broken, or perhaps it continues right now in ways we will never fully see. By the time the 20th century staggered into its final decades, the family had already been buried twice, once in the soil of their own hollow, and once beneath the silence of officials who sealed away their history. But there is a third kind of burial, one that is colder than earth and sharper than law. That burial came at the hands of outsiders who turned tragedy into spectacle, who transformed a bloodline into a sideshow. The earliest intrusions came from doctors. In the 1940s and 50s, word of the family leaked into medical circles. Quiet whispers passed between universities, an isolated clan marked by congenital deformities hidden in Appalachia. For physicians hungry for data, the family was not a community, not a tragedy, but a case study. Teams of researchers traveled to the ridge with clipboards and measuring instruments. They charted skull dimensions, noted jawlines, documented skeletal irregularities. Every anomaly became a line in a paper, every child a paragraph. But the doctors never asked permission. They did not seek consent. They arrived with the cold detachment of men collecting specimens, and when they left nothing behind. No treatment, no aid, no attempt to ease the suffering of those they examined. Their notes ended up in medical journals that never used the family's true name, disguising them under letters and pseudonyms. But locals knew. The moment those papers circulated, whispers doubled. The hollow was branded not with sympathy, but with shame. Then came the journalists. By the 1960s, rumors of an inbred Appalachian family had begun to drift beyond the mountains. Newspapermen, always hungry for sensation, followed the trail. They didn't bring instruments, but cameras. They photographed cabins from a distance, wrote lurid descriptions of twisted children and hillbilly degeneracy, and sold it to readers who craved a grotesque spectacle. Appalachia itself became a backdrop for horror, the family a symbol of everything wrong with the poor and the rural. No names were printed, but the effect was the same. Whole communities bore the stigma. Children from the region were mocked in schools hundreds of miles away, branded as inbred because of one family's fate. The sins of obsession and isolation were rewritten as cultural inheritance, as if poverty and geography themselves were somehow diseased. The tragedy of one family became a weapon used against thousands. By the 1970s and 80s, the tabloids seized hold. You've seen the covers. Shocking secrets of America's inbred clans. Hidden monsters of the hills. These were not articles. They were grotesque carnival posters, painting Appalachian people as freaks, turning tragedy into entertainment for supermarket checkout lines. And once again, the family was voiceless. They could not speak for themselves. Their story was told for them, stripped of dignity, amplified into myth. Even academic researchers were guilty. Some came with good intentions. Anthropologists who wanted to understand isolation, sociologists who studied poverty's grip, but too often their findings slipped into the same frame. Case studies, specimens, curiosities. The family became data. Their humanity dissolved into statistics. And when these studies made their way back into public discourse, stripped of nuance, the image of the Appalachian inbred hardened into stereotype. Think about the cycle here. First, secrecy inside the family. Then, silence from officials. Then, intrusion from outsiders who replaced truth with spectacle. Each step erased something. The journal erased individuality in the name of purity. The graves erased children in the name of silence. The officials erased history in the name of control. And the media erased humanity in the name of profit. Layer upon layer of erasure until nothing remained but myth. And myths, once they are born, are almost impossible to kill. Even today, if you search for the family, what you find are not the facts. You find clickbait headlines, lurid YouTube thumbnails, grotesque caricatures of people with wide-set eyes and vacant expressions. You find fiction presented as fact, exaggeration passed as history. The family is no longer remembered as victims of their own obsession or of society's failure to intervene. They are remembered as monsters. But monsters are useful. They sell papers, they fill pages, they generate views. The family's tragedy was never given a chance to breathe as tragedy. It was packaged, exported, consumed. In this way, their silence was broken, but broken in the cruelest way possible. Not with truth, not with dignity, but with distortion. There is a painful irony in this. For generations, the family kept their law of purity because they feared contamination from the outside. Yet it was the outside that ultimately consumed them, not through marriage, not through blood, but through story. Outsiders violated their secrecy, their graves, their identities, and in doing so, outsiders fulfilled the prophecy the family feared most. They were contaminated, not by blood, but by spectacle. When you strip away the tabloid glare, what's left? A family trapped by obsession, children buried in silence, officials who looked away, and a world that, when it finally looked, did so only to point and laugh. That is the cruelest burial of all, not under soil, not under sealed files, but under ridicule. And this raises a question that should disturb us more than any myth. When we consume these stories, when we click, when we laugh, when we pass along grotesque tales, are we any different from those journalists with their cameras, those doctors with their measuring tools, those officials sealing away the bones? Are we not just adding one more layer of silence, one more distortion on top of the truth? The family became myth because it was easier for us, easier to call them monsters than to admit they were human beings who suffered. Easier to sell spectacle than to wrestle with the reality of what isolation, poverty, and obsession can do to a lineage. Easier to laugh at shadows than to recognize our own reflection in them. In the end, the family did not vanish into the soil. They were not erased by secrecy alone. They were buried in us, in our need for stories darker than truth, in our hunger for monsters we can keep at arm's length. And perhaps that is the most haunting legacy of all. Stories like this rarely end cleanly. They don't close with a neat line or a moral you can fit on a single page. They linger, half remembered, half erased, too heavy to carry and too haunting to set down. That's the weight of the family in the hollow. That's the shadow cast by the graves behind the cabin. For more than a century, their lives were dictated by a single line. The blood must be kept pure. It was not law, not scripture, not even a voice of God. It was a sentence, written by a hand long dead, that became a chain binding generation after generation. It turned love into duty, marriage into confinement, birth into risk. It transformed the most intimate human bond into a ritual of repetition, and the cost was paid in children buried under unmarked earth. And yet, the tragedy was never theirs alone. Others could have intervened. Officials could have acted when the first reports were fill-in. Doctors could have chosen compassion instead of detachment. Journalists could have chosen truth over spectacle. But none of that happened. Silence won, and silence does not simply protect. It corrodes. It allowed the law of purity to stretch further than it ever should have, until nothing was left but graves, rumors, and myths. That's the part we don't like to admit. We tell ourselves stories of monsters because monsters let us feel safe. If we call the family inbred freaks, then their suffering is theirs alone. If we call them Appalachian degenerates, then the story becomes about distance. We are not them. We could never be them. The myth builds a wall between us and the horror. But the truth is harder, because the truth shows us a mirror. The mirror is this: the family's collapse was not simply biology, it was secrecy. It was silence. It was the refusal of outsiders to help, and the eagerness of outsiders to exploit. It was the world's hunger for purity in one form or another: purity of blood, purity of race, purity of nation. Whenever obsession with purity takes root, whether in a mountain hollow or in a palace hall, the result is the same: collapse. You can trace this pattern across history. European royal families, so desperate to preserve dynasties, bred within their own bloodlines until madness and deformity became the inheritance of thrones. Religious sects that shunned outsiders collapsed into insularity and despair. Nations that preached racial purity filled their soil with graves. The family in the hollow is not an anomaly. They are a reflection, a smaller echo of a larger pattern that has repeated wherever purity becomes creed. And this is why the story matters. Not because it is sensational, not because it is grotesque, not because it satisfies some lurid curiosity, It matters because it warns. It warns of what happens when secrecy hardens into law, when silence becomes survival, when outsiders choose spectacle over intervention. It warns that purity, whether in a family, a community, or a nation, is a lie that devours itself. The graves behind the cabin whisper that warning still. They are not curiosities. They are not freak show exhibits. They are testimonies. Every mound of earth is a record of what obsession cost. Every unmarked child is a reminder that silence does not protect, it buries. Think of the journal again. Think of the handwriting passed from father to son, each repeating the same commandment. The blood must be kept pure. Now imagine that journal in another setting. Imagine it as the text of a king desperate to keep a dynasty intact. Imagine it as the speech of a dictator demanding racial purity. Imagine it as the creed of a cult forbidding outsiders from entering. It is always the same sentence, always the same outcome. Collapse written in advance. So where does that leave us? With a choice. We can keep telling this story the way the tabloids told it, as grotesque entertainment, as a myth of monsters lurking in the hills. Or we can tell it as it really is, a tragedy, a warning, a mirror. We can let the graves remain unmarked, or we can name them, not with names lost to history, but with the truth they represent. And perhaps that is the only act of justice left. To strip away the myth, to burn the carnival posters, to silence the grotesque laughter, to say plainly, this was a family. They suffered, they died in silence, and they deserve to be remembered not as monsters, but as victims of obsession, of secrecy, of a world that turned away until it was too late. When you walk through old woods, when you stumble across uneven ground, when you see mounds of earth hidden under moss and leaf, pause. Because those places are not empty. They are full of stories, some written in journals, some in sealed files, some in the bones of children who never saw the sun. And if we ignore them, if we look away, if we allow silence to settle again, then we repeat the same pattern. That is the haunting gift of the family in the hollow. Not myth, not spectacle, not grotesque curiosity. A gift of warning. A reminder that silence is never neutral, that purity is never salvation, that secrecy is never protection. The graves are still there. The journal is still there. The myths are still out there, distorting, exaggerating, feeding on curiosity. But so is the truth, and the truth whispers from the soil, from the shadows, from the silence. Remember us, not as monsters, as human beings, as a warning. Because the final horror is not in the hollow. The final horror is in us. If we choose to forget, if we choose to laugh, if we choose to consume their suffering as entertainment instead of testimony, the graves will remain, the silence will thicken, and the story will repeat somewhere else, in some other name, in some other soil. Unless we listen, unless we remember, unless we finally speak the truth the family was never allowed to tell.